Just spending a few moments waiting for Barbara to come. This will be a conversation with Barbara Morgan and Sarah Peyton. And today we're going to start with the question of trauma in constellations. Hello, Barbara.
Hi. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you too. Yeah. I've been thinking about trauma in constellations, and I've been very curious what your take on trauma in constellations is.
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think it's rapidly becoming an overused word, the same way as the word abuse is overused. And so when I hear sometimes people refer to the fact that they've been traumatized, it's I want more information than that to establish where on the continuum they've put themselves in terms of what they experience as trauma. So that's one thing for me. And the other thing is the issue of re-traumatization, and what does that mean? So again, I think there's a lot of hype around re-traumatization and what it means. And I think some kind of over-caution in some people. So it's like a continuum. Either it's rash, cavalier, or there's too much caution around it, and people are afraid of re-traumatizing somebody. So I think it requires quite a lot of level-headedness and your lovely word, resonance. And the other thing that feels really pertinent for me is something that I picked up from Angwin St. Just about how do you find your self-agency with trauma. So when the moment when you are traumatized, you're powerless. You have no self-agency at all. And how can you recapture that, find that?
Yeah, I know.
The important thing is rage, finding your rage. It's the kind of fight, flight, freeze scenario, and we need to find the fight in us. To be able to kind of lift ourselves out and get beyond the trauma. So those are my kind of pockets of thinking around it. I don't know where you sit in all of that.
Oh, well, in the first pocket, the pocket of do we use the word too much, and what kind of detail do we need? It's certainly a huge umbrella word for so many different things. And since my interest is primarily, or not primarily, but hugely about how do our lives and our language affect our brains, I have this deep interest in how do incidents and different kinds of what the researchers call adverse childhood experiences impact people's brains, impact their lives, impact their agency, and in my experience, most of the folks that I, here in North America that end up crossing my path, surprisingly enough, really minimize their own experiences of childhood adversity. Everybody seems to say to themselves, well, what am I complaining about? I have nothing to complain about. I wasn't beaten until I was black and blue. I wasn't locked in a cupboard. I didn't, I wasn't forced to go without food. People will, it's like a way to manage or dismiss their own experience. It's like an internalized dismissal response instead of the resonance response. Yeah. So it's sort of this interesting world where I agree with you. It can be such an overused word, but at the same time, without much of a sense of realness to it in a way. Yeah. Are you familiar with Bessel van der Kolk and the new book that he brought out? I
haven't read it, but I know about it, yeah.
Yeah, one of his points is that as in the healing professions, people will make all kinds of diagnoses where we're diagnosing all kinds of stuff based on original experiences of childhood trauma. And I mean, even ADHD has huge components that are connected to complex PTSD, to attachment. It's all about trauma, and yet the diagnosis strips away any implication that there's any past history at all. You are just ADHD. It's not that you've had this series of difficult experiences that leave you on high alert.
I mean, I think that ADHD, if we take that as an example, it's like there's a fear in the parents, you know, their own trauma is triggered. So if they can get the label ADHD, they can relax, you know.
Yes, it's not my fault. Doesn't have anything to do with me. My child is just this. Yeah.
And you can see just by the behavior that the child is traumatized and needs a lot of help, because they're acting out whatever the parents' trauma is. And I do think that attachment is such a important factor, you know, that if you're strongly attached, you've got a healthy attachment, then you can deal with trauma far more readily, far more easily.
So true. They were looking at this in the U.S. Army. They were looking at what are soldiers' attachment styles, and then how likely are they to have PTSD after their service.
Right.
The less secure their attachment was, the more likely they were to have post-traumatic stress after battle experiences.
And I think that's really true. I mean, one of the things that I'm noticing is I've got a dental phobia.
Oh.
And somebody has suggested to me to try some EMDR.
Oh.
You know, so, but talking to her, I've just had like an introductory meeting. I'm realizing that actually a dental phobia also links into early trauma and how healthily attached I was or wasn't, and that sort of thing. So it's not as simple as, you know, I've got a phobia with the dentist, I'll just go and sort it out so I can get my teeth done. I do think it's complicated, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, at the other end of the continuum, on the first training I did in this country, first Constellations training, I had two people who came and they sat in one kind of particular part of the room during the 5-day module, very still, hardly moved. Both did their constellations, interestingly, in which one of which there was a lot of anger and the other one there was hatred, all kinds of things. And they left the training saying they'd been traumatized.
Oh.
Now, for me, that was like, well, really? You know, where's the trauma in your experience? You know, you were angry, but I didn't see the link with trauma. So I think it's really interesting how we diagnose it, how we define it, and how we resonate with the way somebody names trauma. My experience is somebody who's really seriously traumatized does what you've been talking about. You know, they minimize it.
Yes, so often.
Say it's not too bad, or I've survived, or, you know, that kind of coping mechanism.
Nothing happened.
Yeah.
I have a person that I've worked with for years in the women's prison south of Portland, Oregon. And often, and her story, I think, really illustrates this tendency. She says, I don't know what's wrong with me. I had the best childhood. I had the sweetest, my parents were so good to me. They loved me so much. And then, you know, you'll spend a little longer talking, and then she'll talk about the time when she was physically thrown through a plate glass window. You know, there's such an experience of us almost not even realizing, when it's quite serious.
Not allowing ourselves to realize.
Not allowing ourselves to realize. Yeah.
I mean, I worked with a client for a long, long time who never felt robust enough to come to a Constellations workshop. But, you know, I did do some work actually on her behalf with Bert, which was amazing, really beautiful. But, you know, she would sit for hours and hours and hours, unable to speak, barely able to communicate with me, having to kind of write things down and that sort of stuff. And she was my best teacher ever in terms of how to resonate with somebody, you know.
Yeah, that it doesn't have anything to do with what words you choose to use, or just, it's just about being there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and she was so hyper vigilant, you know. She would come in and say, "Oh, you look tired today," you know? And I had to be so on the ball and so authentic with her, you know, so that she could learn to trust me. And I mean, she came for 7 years, twice a week, and paid me £5 a session. But I learned, I mean, that was the enormous gift for me.
Yeah.
She went from, she was physically and sexually abused daily for 27 years. And it was still happening when she came to me.
Yes.
And she was alcoholic, in debt to £22,000 and all kinds of stuff. And she got herself through it, you know. She left the family home, she got a job, she started doing some gardening, then she got a relationship, you know. So it was amazing, absolutely amazing what she managed to do. And all I did was love her.
Aww.
Really.
That
was all I did. Yeah. So, you know, that's the resonance that you talk about. You know, I really resonated with her as best I could. It wasn't easy at times because she would test me, you know. Come in and say, "Oh, I've just been driving 100 miles an hour and no safety belt on," you know. But, you know, amazing woman, yeah. So I think those experiences are very humbling. And I think the other aspect for me is being able to catch when someone is going to move into some re-traumatization, you know, and sometimes it's so quick. You know, there was a woman who was having night terrors, really, and she was just about to go into a relationship, and she'd always had to sleep with the light on. She was 20-something. So she decided, actually, I need to do something about this, you know, and the first constellation she did, there was somebody who was sort of on the ground behaving like a child that had special needs. And she just suddenly flipped and was completely traumatized. So I had to stop the constellation, get her out of it and all the rest of it. And then I suggested she go and talk to her parents. And what they said was the guy had an uncle, I think it was, who had a child with Down syndrome who'd been institutionalized. And what she said was she'd seen this child being thrown at the wall. Now, who knows whether that actually happened, but, you know, it's quite possible. So then she came to another workshop. We set it up so that she was a safe distance away. Very interesting, different people, different room, but the same process happened, same process. And then somebody gave out this enormous roar. Anyway, she managed it, she survived it, she did what she needed to do in relation to it, and the night terrors left her. So, you know, that was a really a heavy number.
and a tribute to the connection that's possible between, even if you have a client that has to have a constellation stopped, that, and the facilitator, like you did, can, you know, be aware of what's happening with the level of overwhelm that the person is in, and care for them, that they could come back and have a successful second experience, is really a tribute to the resiliency and the power of care.
Yeah, I mean, I think holding good boundaries, I mean, there's a balance, isn't there, between too much aftercare and not enough aftercare.
Yeah.
You know, and if someone's really flipped into a trauma like that, then I think they do need some support afterwards. I know some facilitators don't agree with that at all, but I do follow up with people who've been seriously, You know, I mean, I had one person who was trying to climb out the window. You know, she was pretty traumatized. You know.
Let me out of here.
I don't know if you've had any experiences like that, have you?
I have had experiences. One of the reasons I became a facilitator was because I myself experienced kind of being thrown into the hot water of my childhood and not, and kind of left in there to be boiled alive in constellation work. And I thought, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way to do this, because the work itself is so beautiful and stunning, and here I am being boiled alive, and I don't think that's necessary.
So
So
you felt abandoned? Is that what happened? You fell into the trauma and then you felt abandoned?
Well, I don't know if I would use the word abandoned so much as, what word would I use? I had more of a sense that the facilitator was oblivious.
Was she in the field of trauma herself, maybe? Or he?
Yeah, it's very possible. Very possible. Also, I've noticed in my own constellation work that I bring the field of my mother with me very powerfully.
Right.
And that the facilitator will often find themselves becoming my mother. And my mother my mother was definitely oblivious.
Mm-hmm.
Since those family fields can be so powerful, I think it's yes, that's exactly why I wanted to come in. I wanted to see, could I create constellation experiences which were not run by my mother?
Right.
Yeah.
I think the key with that is, as the facilitator, to recognize when you're caught in the field.
Yes.
You know, and I think that's a tricky one with trauma, because you can be in over your head before you've realized it.
That's so true.
And it's being able to kind of, what I call it is, develop the watcher, you know, this it's always slightly here, you know, going, oh, hang on a minute, what's going on here? I don't normally feel like this, you know. Am I caught in the field here?
Yeah.
I mean, I find the whole realm of like tuning into what's going on in the field so beautiful. I mean, I think it's such an asset to be able to do that, particularly with trauma, because if it's shared around the group, it's more manageable, you know, than one person or the facilitator and the one person. It could get so intense. If you've got a group of people, it does something, you know, it's like they can hold it as a bigger group much more easily than one individual can.
Such enormously beautiful things happen when this is true. Just the hugest things get held. Death during childbirth, and you know, abuse, just as you had named, like the decades of abuse that people can live through.
I had quite an interesting one at there was a conference in Copenhagen 2 or 3 years ago.
Yes, I was at the conference. Yes.
So I offered a workshop. I don't even remember what the workshop was on, what the theme was. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But this person, she was kind of questioning me before the workshop started. I thought, it's interesting what she's doing, as if she was kind of testing out my reliability, my trustworthiness, something like that. Anyway, then she asked to do a constellation, and what she said was, I want to do it completely silently, without telling anybody what I'm setting up or what it's about or anything. So this was a challenge to me, you know, this is a demonstration, obviously. So I said, okay. So I kind of let it go and let her do her thing. And she did the whole process without a word, without saying what she was setting up or anything. And the constellation rolled on. And anyway, then afterwards, I said to her, so how was that? And she said, amazing, really insightful. So I said, oh, Great. So would you like some feedback from people? And I assumed she would say no, but she said yes. So as we went round, many people were angry.
Oh.
I hated it. I didn't have a clue what was happening. You know, it was traumatic for me. Da, da, da. And all that went on, and yet she seemed to be getting something from it. And then I said at the end, okay, so how are you now? Because I hadn't got a clue what she'd worked through. But what she said, what I thought was really interesting, and it stayed with me, she said, that's the first time, she said, I've done a lot of work over the years. That's the first time I felt safe.
Wow.
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I have this sense that the work itself holds so much promise and people can feel the promise.
Yeah.
And they're almost like they're looking for the constellation facilitator that can give birth to the promise that they have a sense is here. Yeah.
And I think as the facilitator, it's about, I mean, you know, it's impossible to be completely unafraid, but as far as possible,
yes,
unafraid, to take risks, to not know, to be in the mess with them and all the rest of it, resonance again. And to just go with whatever is coming in the moment. And I think that's, you know, it's a powerful experience, and it's a difficult experience at times. I mean, I love the work of Peter Levine, you know, working with the body and the pendulation, you know, going from a place of strength, resource, into the trauma and coming back again. So I do use that at times with clients, you know, who are struggling on the edge of trauma. But I mean, I think the other thing is being able to stay level-headed. And I learned that from Hunter Beaumont, you know, to sort of talk in an ordinary voice, keep your feet on the ground, you know, and when someone's flipping out to just, you know, I mean, I remember him once in a 5-day workshop, this was many years ago, there was a guy who we'd got to the end of the 5 days, and in the last 5 minutes he flipped. He was re-traumatized about something. And many women gathered around him, and they were empathizing, trying to comfort him and all the rest of it. Hunter walked the full length of the room, grabbed him by the arm and said to him in a very strong voice, "Get up out of that chair and go and wash your hands." I was like, wow. Anyway, it brought him out. I mean, it's so fascinating. I'd never seen that kind of level of, well, was it resonance? I don't know what you'd call it. But, you know, he shifted from the traumatized place that he was in, and he grew up, basically, became a man, and off he went and washed his face and hands and came back, and he was ready to go home. Now, I don't know what would have happened if that process had gone on earlier in the week or in the workshop and it wasn't at the end. And I'm assuming it was because it was at the end that Hunter behaved the way he did. But I was just shocked by the powerful effect. Very different from the women who were around him it was all women, trying to empathize and, you know, attune to him and be where he was and all the rest of it. And actually it wasn't helping him at all. It's hard to know what's needed at times.
Yes, it's so hard to know what's needed. At one point, several years ago, because I've been interested in trauma, not just today, but for multiple years, I wrote something to the International Listserv about people being traumatized, and about paying attention to clients and how we track whether or not they've entered a trauma state. Whether or not they'd entered a trauma state. Like,
what's the association you wrote to? International?
An International Constellations Yahoo group.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yes.
I received 9 responses from people quoting Bert Hellinger, saying, if I'm paying attention to the client, then I am betraying the constellation. I was so interested to receive so many responses, and I didn't receive any that said that they enjoyed what I written. So I stopped contributing.
I mean, what is he saying there? He's basically saying empathy. Empathy is not what you need. That's really what he's saying, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if that's entirely true. I think there are times when empathy is needed, but it's like knowing to what extent you empathize and to what extent you remain separate enough that you can do something different to just empathy.
And I have been thinking a lot about this, about the different way that one will use, because as you know, my other practice, I do a practice of constellation work, but then I also have a depth empathy practice, which is all about what happens when we catch the precise emotional tone and the deep longings and needs for acknowledgement that are present in somebody's expression. So I think a lot about language. I think a lot about what kind of language makes us fluid and what kind of language puts us into a static story of like I am like I'm a victim. My life was not fair. This should never have happened to me. Those people did me wrong, and sort of this cycle that goes again and again, right? That's kind of the cycle that people can get into, where they just stay there if nothing ever happens, if there's no constellation work, if there's no resonance. But I've been thinking a lot about the difference between the kind of language that's used in constellation work and the standpoint of the constellation facilitator in comparison with the kind of language that's used in resonance work and the standpoint of the person there.
So can you say a bit more about that? So I presume it's in your book, is it?
The book doesn't talk about constellations, but it does talk about the resonant language that's that moves people, that starts to shift story.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. One of the ways that I work with people is I work with them and ask their permission to have them tell me what's happening in their body. Because when we're speaking directly to the body, then the body really likes resonant language, and it kind of relaxes and shifts. So I was working up in Canada the last 2 days. I was doing a public workshop up there, and so I was having people say what the voice of their inner critic was saying. It was a workshop about transforming the voice of the inner critic. So, for example, somebody's inner critic would say, "You're too much. You are too big. You're too much. You get in people's way. You're insensitive. You're too much." And so then, the kind of inquiry that I would make would be, if I were speaking directly to the inner critic, it would be something like, "I wonder if you would like some acknowledgement that this person, this body, has lived in experiences where the people around them had reactions that were painful and difficult." And then also something like, so let's say this person's name is David. David, are you really, or inner critic, are you really worried about David's well-being? Are you wanting him to have social grace? Are you longing for there to be some hope of belonging? So those kinds of inquiries that are really about what we long for. Because when we start to tap into what do we need acknowledged and what do we long for, it dissolves stories. Like,
it's relationship and connection that we long for, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I can hear as you're talking, it's like you're having like a direct route to the soul.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I would see the singing is like that, you know?
Yeah.
The way it just goes straight through to the soul. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Mm.
Yeah. So that's such sweet and beautiful work. And yet it is so different from constellation language.
Mm.
When I first started, when I talked about when I first started, and I was wanting to bring this kind of resonance and gentleness constellation work. And yet it doesn't, it just wastes time.
Well, the toughest thing that I see as a trainer is the people who are psychotherapists, are very used to empathizing and listening to somebody's story and resonating and all the rest of it. They have to undo some way of being before they can be a constellation. Those who don't have that training actually
can move more quickly into that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
But the language is still, even though it's not that, focus on longings and acknowledgments in the same way, it's the language that a constellation facilitator uses can be so resonant.
Yeah.
And there's something, I think, I've been wondering if a way to describe it might be truth-telling.
Yes, that's how I would see it. I
Yeah.
mean, that's number one for me, is like the deepest truth. And that's how I see Bert. He holds truth as the kind of the biggest thing, really, the most important thing. And what I do is like this kind of doing my own internal resonance. What's my body saying to me?
Yeah.
And sometimes I do say to people, I notice I feel really angry.
Yeah.
Or irritated, or whatever it is. I mean, there was a beautiful example of this. This was again many years ago, and I imagine this woman was traumatized, but we didn't get to the trauma. She sat down next to me, and somebody got up to make a cup of tea. Somebody else got up to do the curtain. There was a lot of restlessness around, and I just felt I couldn't be bothered with this woman. I said, this is really strange. I feel like I can't be bothered to do a constellation with you. I know it's hard to say, but it was my truth. She was upset by that, and she went and sat down and all the rest of it. Then in the very next constellation, she got up halfway through and walked out of the room, and it felt so disrespectful. So it was like somehow her coping mechanism was to be disrespectful, and that's what got triggered in me. Like, I didn't have any respect for the woman, and neither did anybody else. They were all kind of acting out all kind of stuff that she was saying, you're not important. So it was fascinating. Like, talk about getting caught in the field.
Yeah.
But it was a resonance. It was a really deep resonance with something in her that I guess was a survival mechanism, a way of not touching whatever was behind it. And she never did. I mean, she left and didn't come back. There was no way that I was going to get beyond that barrier that she set up.
Barrier.
Yeah. Speaking the truth there felt really important. To kind of cut through any pretense of, I mean, had I empathized with her, I'd have been totally inauthentic. I didn't feel any empathy towards her at all. So, I think you're right. Truth is the key, really.
And
hard as that is sometimes.
And having, had the experiences myself of my mother taking over the constellation facilitator, I feel a lot of empathy for our person who walked out of the room.
But I suppose the important thing there is like what happens to you, when that goes on, and that a progression. Like each time that happens, do you manage to do something different in relationship to it? Than at the beginning, is there an improvement as time goes on in terms of how you relate to that?
I loved Stephen Hausner was doing some work at Burn Reed, and he had a similar reaction to the person who came and sat down beside him. And he set up for us to see the constellation. He put up a representative for himself and a representative for the client. And the client leaned in to the representative for the facilitator so hard that it was pushing the facilitator over.
Fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. And Stefan used this to talk about this very phenomenon, about what are some options and choices of transparency, clarity, letting them know, and the person that he was having this experience with told him that the previous year they had the same thing happen with their facilitator, but the facilitator hadn't gone into transparency,
right.
had gone, had done honest, authentic expression, but hadn't talked about the phenomenon. And there was, and in this case, there was able to be some movement. So that's been something that supported me immensely. I was working in California, and the woman who was sitting beside, I kept thinking, this is all bullshit. It was just like, she was sitting beside me, and I was like, this is all bullshit. This is all bullshit. And so I set up a representative to hold that for me, who was standing behind me. I put them standing behind me. And
did you name it as "This is all bullshit"?
No, I didn't. Having been traumatized by my own constellation facilitators in the past, I tend to be very gentle. So anyway, I set up this as a unnamed.
Right.
And as the constellation evolved, I was working so hard to get to a feeling of authenticity within myself, trying to be really grounded in my own body sensations, working against this for quite a while. Finally, we're getting some stuff cleared away. There's a little bit of movement. The woman's husband was in the room. He stood up and he screamed, "This is all bullshit!"
Oh no!
It was quite something. And then the person that I had set up to support me came in as the woman's true voice.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the husband and the woman's true voice came together. And when that happened, then everything melted. And the client was able to, move into connection.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah. It was one of the hardest constellations I've ever done.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
But it's a bit, talking about Stefan, it's like a way of working with what's in the field without necessarily doing it directly. Like if you set yourself up, set up a person to represent you as the therapist, then you can see it more, can't you?
Yes.
You're not actually in it yourself.
Yeah.
And I think he's got some wonderful, I was going to say tricks, but ways of working that are amazingly powerful.
Yeah. It's one of the things that I love so much about us getting to go to Burn Read is that we get to experience lots of different people's explorations of and talking about this.
Yeah.
Constellation facilitators are so sprinkled all over the globe.
I know. Yeah, and it's one place where we all come together and we can have our different experiences.
Cross-fertilize a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing for me linked into that is like our relationship to the constellation. I don't know where I got this from, but sometimes what I do is set up the person and their constellation after they've done it.
Oh.
Just to see, like, what's the relationship now with the constellation? Does the constellation feel seen? Does the client feel seen by the constellation? And sometimes when people want to do another one very quickly after the previous one, that's quite common in Romania. I've done that one. Now let me console the next one. It's got multiple traumas.
Yeah.
Sort of desperation in there. If you then set up the constellation, you can see quite often that they've turned away. They haven't allowed the constellation to really land and impact on them and be brought into the body fully. It's fascinating. I mean, it's a great way to, without having to challenge direct.
Yes.
Set it up, and then you can see it happen.
That's beautiful. I love that. I wonder if it's a similar. I just brought Elena Veselago to the U.S. in November and got to travel with her and translate for her while she was here. one of the things that she was speaking about was the history of constellations in Russia, and that during the Stalinist purges, a lot of the sort of tendrils and growths of psychotherapy and the helping professions really got wiped out, you know, in all of the death. And so in Russia, constellations are so important and so popular because it's really one of the few options that people have to have access to support and healing. Is that true in Romania as well?
In a slightly different way, but I think the thing with Romania is that the trauma is so there that they kind of wanted to grab whatever's there. I mean, I think there is some psychotherapy. There's definitely a lot of TA I've seen, but it's also there. I mean, I don't know Russia well enough. I only know Elena. It's their way of being. You know, they're very out there. Lots of energy.
They're going for it.
Right, you know, and they kind of race to get into the seat next to me, and you know, sort of pushing each other out of the way almost. They talk. It's fascinating. So different.
So
Britain, you know, in England, there's such a different energy, a much more sort of depressed energy, if you like. I mean, we've talked about that. I had an interview in Romania, and I was saying how it's different ways of managing trauma. So in Romania, it's so much more like that. And in England, there's this depression, you know, it's like a sort of a low-lying depression. And it's maybe that we've been perpetrators so often, you know, in those traumatic situations, but we're often the perpetrator in those traumatic situations. Whether it's that, I don't know. I mean, I haven't quite got to the bottom of it, but it's really fascinating for me to work with those opposing,
such different, different groups.
And then Ireland, you know, Ireland is different again. You know, they're very warm and affectionate people, and more alive than in England, if you like. I mean, these are generalizations, of course, and I'll probably upset a lot of people by saying that. But you know, they're working through a lot of their trauma through song, you know, through music, alcohol, unfortunately. But, you know, there's a lot happening. There's a very community-minded way of being in Ireland. That's what I see. You know, they're very close with each other and they support each other and that sort of thing. And I think that's a way of managing trauma, you know.
Yes, so true. And I'll just say a few words and then we'll close, just about Japan and North America. I'm so used to working in North America. I do a little bit of work in Poland, and people from Western Europe come. But in Japan, it was like I was trying to listen so carefully for the whisper. It was like the field, like I didn't quite know how to tune my body to the Japanese field yet, and so I could catch echoes of whispers. And it was like when I'm in a North American field, I can just feel the energy, I have a sense of things, people speak, and I have some sense of like, okay, here's where we could dig in. In Japan, it was like I was listening so carefully to hear such a different sound.
Subtle. Very subtle. That's nice. I think when I have one of my favorite restaurants in London is a Japanese sushi restaurant, and when I look at their architecture, you know, in terms of the food that they serve up and the delicacy and, you know, the intricacy of a carrot, you know, that looks like an amazing Japanese tower, you know. That's what I feel. It's like a sort of very subtle energy, you know, and then it's contrasted with the samurai warrior, you know.
Yes. Clarity, precision, abruptness.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So, Barbara, it's been really fun to get to talk to you. It feeds and nourishes me, and I take what we talk about and think about it and turn it over. Love it.
Again soon. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you today.
Thanks, love.
Okay. Bye to you.
Bye.